Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this presentation. Today we're going to cover all about oral history. It is, short and sweet. There is so much you can learn about doing oral history and about the practice of it and how it started and how it's used in communities, but we really only have a little bit of time today. So, I'm really going to dive deep and quick into a few topics. And of course, as we move forward, there can be more sessions, but today's just a quick dive into it. So, to give a little bit of context, my name is Lindsay Ann Herring. I am the folklorist with Pennsylvania Rural Arts Alliance. We are based out of Indiana, PA, but we cover 5 different counties and within rural Western PA. And part of what we're doing is we got a grant project to start an oral history program in partnership with a few libraries. So I am so excited to be starting this um, and bring these services to everyone. This is funded in part from Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, so we are very thankful for their contributions. So, what is oral history? Well, oral history is a sound recording that you can listen to. It contains historical information that is obtained from an interview, and in this interview, the person you're talking to, they're sharing about their life and their life experience, an eyewitness account of a particular experience. Sometimes it's of their childhood, sometimes it's of, let's say maybe they were in World War II and they shared about a particular experience in that. So, with these oral histories, listeners can better understand how individuals from different backgrounds, time periods, experiences, and more, how they went about their everyday life, or how they had a particular experience. And again, this can include just the day-by-day account of their life, or if they witness a specific event or an important event or an era of a time period. Since we are the Folk and Traditional Arts program with Pennsylvania Rural Arts Alliance, I'm particularly interested in heritage practices, customs, traditions. For example, we're interested in documenting stories such as how quilters learned how to do so from their family lineage, or how heritage gardeners learned to do their garden. But really, all experiences and stories make up a rich community and are valuable to oral history. So these interviews are preserved because we want to make sure that they are available for future researchers and listeners. And why is it important? Well, one, it helps us fill in gaps in the historical record. Oral history provides a fuller, it gives a more accurate picture of the past by augmenting the information that is provided in public records, statistical data, photographs, maps, letters, diaries, and other historical materials. So eyewitnesses to events, people who experienced an event firsthand, they contribute to various viewpoints and perspectives that fill in the gaps in documented history. Sometimes they even correct or contradict what is in written word. So interviewers are able to ask questions that are left out of current records. And oral history can interview people whose stories may have been untold or even forgotten. At times, an interview may serve as the only source of information available about a certain place, event, or a person. So, oral history, it's a tool. It's used to supplement history. It helps us to capture diverse viewpoints. It also helps us to enrich the historical understanding and helps us to understand change over time, how things became the way they were, and maybe it can help us look to the future where things can go. Oral history is especially useful for capturing stories from minority groups, marginalized communities, small communities who are often underrepresented in formal histories. Oral history can help us get a more well-rounded story about an event or a person by capturing different points of view. And doing so, it helps younger generations develop empathy and create cross-generational connections and help develop change over time as well. So, who are the people that we interview? In every community, in families, neighborhoods, workplaces, and schools, there are people who have knowledge and skills to share. These are ways of knowing and doing that often come from years of experience and have been preserved and passed down across generations. As active participants in community life, I call these people bearers of tradition, as they are primary sources of culture and history. They are, as folklorist Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett writes, living links in the historical chain, eyewitnesses to history, shapers of a vital and indigenous way of life. They are unparalleled in the vividness and authenticity they can bring to the study of local history and culture. So, through documenting their memories and stories, the past comes to life in the present, filled with vivid images of people, places, and events. And it's not only the past that we discover, we learn about the living traditions, the foodways, celebrations, customs, music, occupations, and skills that are a vital part of daily experience. These stories, memories, and tradition are a powerful expression of community life and values. They anchor us in a larger whole, connecting us to the past, grounding us firmly in the present, giving us a sense of identity and roots, belonging, and purpose. Now, a tradition bearer can be anyone, young or old, who has knowledge and skills and experience to share. For example, a third grader can be a tradition bearer, a knowledge bearer, who knows maybe a hand clapping game that they share among school children on the playground that they learned from someone the year above them. A family member who knows about the special foods that are always prepared for holiday celebrations is a tradition bearer, or the neighbor that you have who's lived in your community for many years and can tell you about local history and ways of life. And it must be said, though, to be careful with this. While oral history is a very powerful, welcomed thing by affirming the narrator's own experience, it does leave an opening for oral history to be used for a romanticized or nostalgic view of the past without really getting into the understanding as to why or how things are remembered the way they are. So, a large goal of oral history is to go in depth into the notions that people have, to explore how people interpret their own experiences, and more broadly, how, as a society and how, as a determined collective history, shapes the remembrances of those experiences over time. So, I'm going to give a few examples to maybe just help you place it a bit better, how oral history projects are used within communities. A few years back, worked with the Heinz History Center located in Pittsburgh, PA, and they were doing an oral history project on documenting Italian immigrants and Italian American community members who lived in the neighborhood Bloomfield. If you're familiar with Pittsburgh at all, you'll know that Bloomfield is Pittsburgh's Little Italy. They even have Little Italy days. Um, Bocce, which is an Italian sport, they have bocce ball courts. So Italian culture has been very ingrained in Bloomfield, as in Pittsburgh as a whole. And so part of this project was interviewing Italian immigrants and Italian Americans who have lived there for years, who are in their 80s and 90s at this point, and who have seen the change over time. So it was fascinating to get to talk to these people and understand, okay, they immigrated straight to this neighborhood. And they had such a thriving community, and how did this change? And what does this community look like now? Um, that was a really lovely project to work on. And then another example, a really great collection that I have looked at before and I just turn to time and again, whenever I'm looking for own inspiration of a successful project, is the Virginia and West Virginia Folkways Online. Um, the collection is comprised of sound recordings, transcripts, photographs, and research notes related to folkways of people living in the mountains near the Shenandoah Valley. So most of the interviewees are people born between 1910 and 1925 who lived in or near the Blue Ridge and Allegheny Mountain ranges in Eastern Virginia and West Virginia. So, interviewees recall childhood stories and memories of livestock, churches, and moonshine. So it's just such a good collection of what life was like during that time period. There's so little of just, other than maybe written journals, of people sharing stories of what their life was like in 1910. So to have that is such a valuable thing. Now to really get into it, what is folklore? Well, the word itself, folklore, it's a combination, obviously, of two words, folk, which means people, and lore, which means knowledge. Culture, it's a combination of ideas, of skills, of customs and traditions, all of these things that make up how we live our day by day, how we live within our community and where we were brought up. Tradition, that refers more often to skills and ways of being that have been passed down from generation or through community or institution. So, what makes an oral history? Well, there are several key characteristics to oral history. It's not just a recording of conversations and events, willy-nilly conversations you'd have with someone on the street. They're not speeches or visual diaries or testimonies. Um, like I said, they're not recordings that lack the guided dialogue between an interviewer and interviewee. And oral history really recognizes that subjectivity. It's important to understand the impact that you yourself has as a person asking the questions and how your own experiences affect the interview. And this also really affects whenever it comes later to question development, which I'll get to in a bit. But really, oral history is in depth. They're not interviews that are about 15 minutes. They are often an hour, sometimes 4 sessions of hour-long interviews. They're recorded with the intent to preserve and to be made available to wider audiences. So these interviews are conducted for um, really deep information about a certain topic or a certain person's experience. Yeah, so oral history is really historical in intent. It looks for insights and perspectives into the past. It's not just capturing events as they're happening. Um, for example, COVID happened pretty recently. So if you were to do an oral history event, it might be good to wait a few years, maybe even longer, to understand the true impact it had on an individual or their community. Maybe someone has long COVID, something like that. It'd be good to wait so you can know what is the impact of that. Um, so oral history really is long term and it's very, very in depth. Another thing, another hallmark of oral history and interviewing within oral history is it's guided in process and grounded in process. It's a dynamic, collaborative relationship between the interviewer and the narrator. The narrator is the person sharing their stories. In this case, the interviewer is the person posing questions based on research and careful preparation, and the narrator shape the interview based on what they deem relevant or meaningful or appropriate to share. And despite the fluid nature of an interview process, maybe you've done journalism in a different context. Oral history is really grounded in thoughtful planning and careful follow through of an agreed upon process. So it contains, prepared questions, research of the community that you're interviewing beforehand, all of that good stuff to make sure that you're well equipped to get as much good information as you can with the very small amount of time that you have with this person. I'm going to go back to that quote actually. Barbara Summers at the bottom. She's a really well-known oral historian, and this quote, I'm just going to read it real quickly. Oral history is characterized by a structured, systematic planning process through research, careful consideration of copyright, emphasis on the depth and detail of information collected, and adherence to strict processing techniques. So to make a solid oral history project, that process, that method in which you shape your project and conduct your interviews, make your interviews accessible for access and interpretation, it needs to stay consistent with your project. Um, and that's why we actually have standards and best practices so the field of oral history can produce high quality interviews that can be used as primary documentation. Um, and that they are valued for what they are and for all of the work that has gone into gathering them. So, all of these resources are online. The Oral History Association has just really great packets of information, PDFs of information on their website of principles and best practices. Um, and the libraries that we're working with also have these printed out at the library. So if you're ever looking for resources, Oral History Association is a good place to go, or go in person as well. They just have produced a good collection of documents that encompass the principles and best practices that really are the standard that oral historians go by. But I'll get into it a little bit today. And it's not as scary as it sounds whenever you hear legal and ethical considerations. Oh boy, that sounds really scary, but it's not. It's just to make sure that the person that you're interviewing is well cared for, respected, that they know what they're getting into. They know that, the stories that they're sharing are going to be stored in a public collection, that kind of thing. So it's really just to protect yourself, to protect the person that you're interviewing. Um, and it's as simple as that. So, um, one thing that I find that's really, really important whenever it comes to this is building rapport and trust with your narrator. Sometimes the people that you're interviewing, this may be the first time that they're sharing or talking about information, or it may be the first time that anyone has even asked them to talk about their experience. Hearing someone say, well, I've never told anyone this before, but that is really important. And that's also really vulnerable. So we want to make sure we respect and protect that. People are giving their time to share their stories, and we want to make sure that those are cared for. So, one thing that you want to consider is informed consent. And that's basically just letting your narrator know that what is happening with the project, anything and everything that's happening with the oral history project. Um, with this library project that we're doing, if you're interested in ever submitting a story, which we can get into later, um, these will be uploaded on YouTube. So anyone can go up to our YouTube account and listen to stories of people who lived in Armstrong County. That's really awesome. But let's say a person was sharing stories and they didn't know that. They might not think that's awesome. They might say, "Hey, I really wouldn't have shared that story about me knocking down that, like mailbox whenever I was 16." Something like that. So you always want to make sure the person that you're interviewing knows what's happening as the end result. The same goes for, like, let's say you do know your original intent is to share the stories publicly. You want to submit them to the library. But let's say you are really inspired by these stories and you want to take them and share them at a conference. Now, because they already signed a consent form saying yes, they are okay with sharing their stories publicly, they acknowledge that, all of that good stuff, you're okay to do it. You don't have to ask for permission again to share their stories in another context. But I always find that it's good practice just to let them know and say, "Hey, I was invited to go and attend a conference, or I was invited to share your story in the newspaper. I just wanted to let you know that I'm doing that." That goes, miles for respect of the person. So I think that's also really important. Another thing that oral history practitioners must be sensitive to is the differences in power between the interviewer and the narrator, as well as divergent interests and expectations inherent to any social relationship. So these dynamics shape all aspects of the oral history process. This includes the selection of people to interview, research questions, personal interactions during the interview, interpretations, decisions on preservation and access, and the various ways that the oral history might be used. So we want to make sure that the people that we are interviewing, like I said, are always being correctly represented. So what we do in order to do that, first, whenever you're building trust and you're informing them of the process, that helps them get comfortable because we want them to be themselves in the interview. We want them to always share the stories openly and feel like they can share information truthfully. So having narrators always know the rights to the oral history. And one of those is that the narrators can withdraw from the oral history project at any time. Let's say they have completed an interview with you and then they change their mind before you publish it and say, actually, can we keep this private? It's always best to do that. Um, that has never ever happened within my experience. That rarely ever happens. But like I said, it's always just good to value and honor the stories that these people share. Now we're getting to the fun stuff. This is my favorite part, the interview design. So whenever it comes to designing the interview, there's just a few things that you want to do beforehand to make sure that you have prepped yourself as best as possible so you can get the best answers as possible, right? So one is doing your homework. It's always a good idea to conduct some background research about the subject you're interested in at the library, maybe on the internet or by visiting a museum or archive. So books and pamphlets and photographs, maps, family documents, any or all of these can help give you information on your subject before you go into an interview. Like I said, knowing more can help you ask better questions and yield a richer interview. So prepare a list of questions before ahead of time. Make sure that they are clear, concise, and open-ended. Um, avoid I just said, avoid questions that elicit simple yes or no answers. So steer away from broad generalities. These are typically like do or did, you know, did you work at your dad's auto shop growing up? That's a yes or no question. Instead, you want to might say, what was working at your father's auto shop like for you? Why did you leave that industry? What did he do with the industry whenever he retired? Things like that instead of did he do, that helps give more full questions. So one thing that's really helpful is also knowing which questions are key. But don't be tied to the list that you have. The questions are meant simply to help focus and guide the interview. You may find that halfway through the interview, the person that you're interviewing, they talk about something that you did not expect, but that you think is going to be really important or useful or valuable. You don't have to stick to your interview questions that you created. In fact, um, it's almost kind of rude if you are staring at the questions that you have and you don't look up at them at all. And I think it's really helpful to have a list, but use them as a guide in case you get trapped, or look at them, whenever it's almost time to ask the next question, you remind yourself what the next question is, and then you look back at the narrator and you make eye contact. It's a really simple way of helping the interviewee, the narrator, feel comfortable. Um, and it creates a natural flow of conversation rather than an awkward, you know, here's a question, here's an answer. Um, Another thing that I think is helpful whenever it comes time to actually designing your interview structure is to give it structure. So think of it as a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. So build your questions and link them together in a logical way. So start with maybe, let's say you wanted to learn about this person's experience growing up within this community. Let's say it's the Bloomfield community, an Italian immigrant. We'll say, what was it like growing up in Bloomfield? Rather than saying, what was it like to retire in Bloomfield? So think about it chronologically. How does it make sense? I do find that sometimes it's helpful to have a pre-interview with the person that you're interviewing. You can use this pre-interview, like a 10-15 minute call or visit, to just discuss any potential topics, to gather biographical data that might be missing. It's really helpful too, just to build connections with your narrator so that they can feel more comfortable talking about sensitive topics. Um, During this pre-interview, or at least an established reporter connection, it's really important. You want to make sure that your narrator is comfortable talking about maybe more sensitive topics. So during this pre-interview, you can assess their level of comfort on discussing certain topics. And you can also learn, what they don't want to talk about. If they have anything that they say, I do not want to talk about that at all, you can use this pre-interview as a time to discover that. Lastly, it's really good to just be aware of your surroundings during your interview design. You know that you're going to interview in the library basement. Well, does the library basement have a dehumidifier that runs? You might want to turn it off for that hour that you're interviewing. Do you have a stopwatch that will go off every hour? You want to make sure that maybe that's taken off and set in a different room because the recorder that you use, no matter what kind of recorder, maybe even if it's just your phone, will pick up on that, and that can be distracting for future listeners. So there's a lot of things to consider, but as you go along, it's kind of just common sense as you go along, and it gets quite easy as you do it a few times. So during the interview, take time to introduce yourself, to establish connection, a feeling of comfort and connectedness with the person that you're interviewing. Um, Even though you probably had a pre-interview, it's always helpful to also, again, at the beginning of the actual interview, to discuss the purpose of the interview, to describe the nature of the project. Um, During the interview, whenever you're recording, it's great to set the recorder within easy reach so you can adjust it if necessary. Place it equal levels in between you and the narrator. Like I said, try to find a quiet area. Um, and run a test too of the recorder before you actually set into the interview. So you might want to, just test and say, listen back to it and go, "Oh man, that was actually like really loud. Let's try and figure that out." Use that time to figure it out. Yeah. Another thing that you can do during the interview is use visual materials. Let's say maybe you know the person pretty well and you've been able to collect newspaper clippings, or maybe you asked the person to bring in a few photos of their family. Those can be great guides during your interview. Um, Especially if your interviewer likes to get off topic too. You can go back to those visual physical materials too as help. Another thing that's really important is to never run the recorder without your interviewee's knowledge. That's really important. Um, Lastly, it's good to participate in the conversation without dominating it. Try not to interrupt and don't be afraid of silence. Give the person that you're interviewing time to think and respond. Be alert to what your tradition bearer wants to talk about and be prepared to detour from the list, like I said, if they have a rich subject that you haven't even thought of. This is really, really great whenever it does happen. Sometimes they can be a bit windy and go around a bunch of different bends of maybe information that isn't useful, but sometimes you'll hit a gold mine of something that is just fascinating. So, yeah. Another thing that I do is I always like to keep notes during my interview. I find that this is really, really helpful. Just in case that we talk about something and I say, "Ooh, I want to go back to that later." Not right now, but in a few minutes. That way you don't forget what they had mentioned. Um, Another thing is to be sensitive to the needs of your tradition bearer. If they're getting tired, stop the interview and schedule another session. I always find that maybe between 1 and 2 hours is usually just about right for an interview. Another thing that has happened to me personally, and that might happen to you, is that sometimes there might be a mistake during it. And that's okay. Just keep on going. There were a few oral histories that I was listening to at the Heinz History Center with that Bloomfield project where they were taken and recorded in the interviewee's home, in the narrator's home, and often these people were around 90. And there were a few times where people stopped in during the actual interview to say hi. Um, and you can still hear that in the interview. It's actually quite fun to listen to. So during that interview, whenever the person walked in, the interviewer just kept the recording going. That is okay to do. So these are the 6 R's of oral history interviewing. So these are from Martha Ross. She's really what we call the mother of oral history in the Mid-Atlantic region. She taught at the University of Maryland in the 70s and the 80s. And all of these just really help to go into all of the things that we had already discussed, but just it helps in a way. So one is research. Just doing your research beforehand, making sure that you know as much as you can. This really pays off during the interview. Another one is rapport, so establishing a close connection with the person that you're interviewing. Sometimes this can be done with a pre-interview too, if you're not familiar with the person beforehand. A third is restraint. So experiencing the experienced interviewer, they maintain rapport by following good interview techniques. So this is being efficient but unobtrusive with equipment, starting at the beginning and proceeding chronologically, like we had discussed. Listening closely without interrupting is a big one. You're here to interview the person. They're not there to listen to your stories. So that's also something to consider. And then sometimes maybe challenging questionable information in a non-threatening way. And generally just maintaining an atmosphere in which the interviewee feels able to respond fully and truthfully. Number four is retreat. So this one's interesting. It's really just making sure you end each interview session by asking a deflationary question. So that can be like a question of, what was your experience of having this interview? Or maybe an overall assessment of, some sort of experience that they discussed. Um, Another thing with retreating too is that these sessions, the interviewee should know how long the session's going to take so they know whenever it's about to wind down. And that's just good for their own knowledge of their capacity and their stamina, as well as just like maybe their own emotional well-being during the interview. Number five is review. So interviewers should always listen to their interviews as soon as possible afterwards. I'm guilty of not doing this. It's really hard for me to listen to myself, as I'm sure it is for other people. But doing this helps you analyze your interview techniques and it allows you to pick up on um, maybe different things that you want to try or different avenues that you'd like to approach. By listening to how you asked questions previously, how to ask them maybe in a more eloquent way or more effective way in the future. And lastly, six is respect. We had talked about this so many times, but it underlies every aspect of oral history. So respect for the individual, their experience, respect towards the practice of oral history. I think it's taken a while for oral history to be taken seriously as a study and as a primary source, right? Outside of research or outside of written um, word. So I think making sure that we always respect oral history as a form of research is great. So, whenever it comes time for the actual interview, you're going to start by saying the date. So, in this case, that would be the month, day, and year, your location. That depends on where you're at. And then your full name and your interviewee's full name. You want to make sure you get that on recording because I have come across oral history interviews that don't have this information. And it's always a bit perplexing to understand and situate it into, oh, what am I listening to? Like, what is the context of this? So making sure you give this kind of information at the beginning of the interview is very helpful. So whenever it comes time to actually designing your questions, like I said, my favorite part, because every individual is unique and every interviewer has their own goals and special interests, there's no single set of questions that will fit every situation. I have this list here, but it might not fit for what you're trying to do. So the following are some that might just help guide an interview with a relative or a community member about family folklore and local traditions. So this list, you're able to pick and choose between them, but ultimately, the most useful questions will be those that you develop yourself based on your knowledge of your own family or community. Remember to not be tied to a formal list of questions, rather to use your questions as guideposts for the interview, to be flexible and to have fun. So these are biographical questions that you'll ask at the beginning to help situate where the person lived or, the context of the actual interview. And then it's also important to know that there are certainly times that the narrator will answer a question you have later on too. If they do, just note it and move on to another question. I always prepare a list of questions to help keep on track, but it is okay if it veers off. Sometimes the narrator will bring up things that aren't even on the list, and that is okay. Sometimes these moments are where the most special, sensitive moments happen, and then sometimes it can be off-topic ramblings. So having a list of questions is really helpful in these moments. Um, so this is a list of family folklore. So if you're interested in interviewing your family or a specific community and their family, this list is great. And of course, this you can pause this and look at this. The libraries have printed out versions of this as well. So if you're ever interested, this is great. There's also some helpful resources online as well. If you're ever interested in other kinds of questions and inspiration of questions, online is a great way to go. Again, here's another list of questions that I think is helpful if you're interested in documenting maybe a community or a local history or an institution. Um, just very, very helpful in many different ways. So whenever it comes time for the interview, there's some equipment you'll need. One is a field recorder, and the library has that. They have all of these things for you to check out whenever it comes time for you to check it out. Um, a librarian will work with you to so you can learn how to use it. It is very, very, very simple, I will say. You'll see the second photo on the left or the second recorder on the left in this photo right here. This is the one that we have at our library, which is pretty cool to see. They have an on and stop button and record button. And again, you'll learn all about that whenever it comes time for you to check out your recorder if you'd like to. But if you're doing this at home and you're doing this away from a library, an iPhone can work just as fine. Use whatever you have at your resources. Another thing that's really helpful is an SD card for the field recorders. This way you can have the recording stored somewhere and you can easily transfer it. Another is a pencil and paper, so you can take notes during your interview, your list of prepared questions that we had talked about, a timekeeping device, so that could be your phone or a watch, just so you know how long the interview's taking, and then batteries. So, like I said, the libraries will have a field recorder, they'll have an SD card, and they'll have batteries at your for your use. So you never have to worry about that. But if you're doing your own oral history project outside of the library, these are all good things to have. So, after the interview, be sure to thank the narrator for their time. This may be the only time that this person has been asked to share about their experience, so that's a really big deal for them. Another thing is to make sure that you get the person you interviewed to write a written release form and that you comply with any restrictions that maybe the interviewee requests. Always ask permission to use the results of the interview in the ways that you initially told the tradition bearer, such as to write for a family history or do a school project. Don't make promises you can't keep and respect confidences and privacy. Label your digital files clearly with the name of the person that you interviewed and the date so you always know what it is that you interviewed. And like I said, if you're doing this through the library project, um, we have a lot of resources and we will help guide you through it. This is more so if you're doing this at home. If you're perplexed by what is a written release form, there are so many resources online for you to create your own. There are resources that I have created at the library as well, so you know what that is. Something that I always find really important to do after an interview as well is to make a transcription. So this is just writing out the audio that you listen to. Nowadays, there's a lot of AI and automated programs that can do this for you, so you don't have to take the time to do it. But this is great for any future researcher that is trying to, quickly gather a quote, quickly trying to read something rather than having to take the time to listen to it. Another thing that I always do is save the files to multiple spaces. You do not want to record a wonderful interview with someone that has very limited time or maybe has mobility issues and you lose that interview, that would be a big bummer. So making sure that you're saving it to multiple spaces is very good practice. Lastly, the fun part. Consider offshoot projects, like we said. Maybe you interviewed a lot of Italian Americans and you noticed that they all talked about food. Maybe a community cookbook is a fun way to go. So there's so many things that you can do with oral history. Um, and as I went through this list pretty quickly, there's also a lot to do after the interview. And since we have limited time here today, I can't get too much into the weeds of what this actually looks like, but there's so many resources at our library. I've purchased books at the library too, if you ever want to go into those and read them, as well as resources online for you to learn more about this process. So, some final considerations. Practice. So, you can only get better at something by practicing. This includes, how to use a recorder easily. It might seem scary at first. It really does. Using new kinds of equipment, can seem intimidating if you're not familiar with it, but you'll only get comfortable with it by trying. I find this concept of practicing also really important whenever it comes to asking questions. You become a really good listener through oral history, and that helps you become a better question asker. So really it's all about doing it and getting comfortable with it over time. But that is all we have for today. I hope that this was helpful. I know it was a very, very quick deep dive, but maybe in the future we could do um maybe longer sessions on, what to do after the interview or practice sessions. So I hope that this was helpful for you in some way. If there are any questions, I can also take those. So thank you so much, everyone.